Have you ever wondered which was the most dangerous prison in the world? In the modern-day Black Dolphin prison of Russia, and ADX Florence of America is considered the worst out of all, but what about history? The history where slavery, wars, and imperialism were at their peak, where there were many candidates for this list from Nazi concentration camps, Gulag camp, and more. But today, we will discuss about the Japanese prisoners of war camp and the experience of Allied prisoners of war. This is the first part of a day in history's most horrific prisons. Japanese camps during World War II were marked by unrelenting brutality, starvation, forced labor, and psychological torment. Japanese POW camps were notorious for their harsh conditions, driven by a combination of military ideology, logistical failures, and the sheer cruelty of the captors. These camps became places where survival was a daily battle, not just against the Japanese soldiers, but also against the environment, disease, and the loss of hope. The Japanese military's approach to POWs was deeply influenced by the principles of Bushido, the samurai code, which regarded surrender as a dishonorable act. This contempt for those who surrendered was reflected in the treatment of POWs, who were seen as less than human by their captors. The guards often inflicted arbitrary beatings, forced prisoners to perform degrading tasks, and subjected them to excruciating punishments for minor infractions. The Japanese believed that a soldier's duty was to fight to the death, and those who were captured were considered unworthy of humane treatment. The ordeal for prisoners began the moment they were captured. After battles in places like Singapore, the Philippines, and Burma, Allied soldiers were forced into camps where they were immediately dehumanized. Stripped of their belongings, often beaten, and shoved into overcrowded barracks, they quickly learned that the Japanese military viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. This attitude shaped the way POWs were treated. A British officer, recounting his experience in one of these camps, said, "We were made to feel less than human from the moment we arrived." Each day started at dawn. Prisoners were woken up between 5 and 6 a.m., not by gentle nudges, but by screams and shouts from the Japanese guards. The day began with a grueling roll call where prisoners were counted and recounted, often while being forced to kneel or stand on sharp stones as punishment for any perceived mistake. This process could last for hours, and any failure to meet the demands of the guards led to brutal beatings. An Australian POW remembered this roll call as the most humiliating part of the day, knowing that no matter how fast or precise we were, someone would still be punished. After the morning roll call, the majority of the day was consumed by forced labor. POWs were assigned to various grueling tasks essential to Japan's war effort, including shipyards and mines. Working in shipbuilding yards or dangerous mines exposed prisoners to hazardous conditions without adequate safety measures. The Death Railway. Many were forced to work on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, a project notorious for its high mortality rate of around 50%. Here, prisoners endured 16-hour workdays, battling extreme heat, rugged terrain, and constant physical abuse. Agricultural labor. In some camps, POWs were compelled to cultivate crops or engage in other forms of agricultural work to sustain Japanese resources. The work was backbreaking and relentless, with little regard for the prisoners' physical well-being. Injuries from accidents were common, and the lack of medical care meant that even minor wounds could become fatal. Over time, the cumulative toll of overwork, malnutrition, and disease led to widespread suffering and death within the camps. Meals were sparse and nutritionally inadequate. The average daily intake was around 1,000 to 1,500 calories, far less than what was required to sustain the intense physical labor prisoners were forced to endure. Despite international conventions that dictated the humane treatment of POWs, Japan largely ignored these guidelines. The Geneva Convention of 1929 stipulated that prisoners should be fed at least to the standard of the captor's own soldiers, but Japan barely followed it. Meals typically consisted of small portions of rice, often mixed with contaminants like dirt, stones, or worse. The lack of food led to drastic weight loss. After only a few months in a camp, the average prisoner weighed just 110 pounds, 49 kilograms. Many survivors described themselves as walking skeleton prisoners, often resorted to eating anything they could find, rats, insects, even grass, to stave off hunger. There were also disturbing reports of cannibalism, particularly in some of the more remote camps. For those deemed too ill or injured to work, rations were halved to around 750 calories in a cruel attempt to motivate them to return to labor. This practice only exacerbated malnutrition and increased mortality rates, as prisoners could no longer sustain themselves under such harsh conditions. After working long, grueling hours, prisoners would return to their barracks, which were nothing more than overcrowded wooden huts. There was little room to sleep, and the conditions were filthy. There was no running water, and soap was a luxury no one could afford. The stench of unwashed bodies, rotting wounds, and human waste was overwhelming. Nights were no reprieve from the torment. Prisoners lived in constant fear of being dragged out for more beatings or punishments for perceived slights. Guards took pleasure in humiliating their captives, stripping them naked, forcing them to crawl, and subjecting them to further torture. Mental illness was rampant, with many prisoners succumbing to a condition known as barbed wire disease, a deep depression brought on by the unbearable living conditions. One American POW, Eric Fung, remembered, "We would lie awake at night, thinking of home, wondering if we'd ever see it again. But slowly, many of us gave up hope and just stopped." This was a typical day for a prisoner. You might wonder how many will be able to survive it. To get a perspective, you need to understand that medical care in the camps was virtually non-existent. The lack of proper medical supplies and trained personnel meant that illnesses and injuries went untreated, leading to high mortality rates. In camps like Niigata and Oyama in Japan, the morbidity rates were alarmingly high. For example, Oyama prison camp recorded 233 cases of vitamin deficiencies, 128 work-related injuries, and 87 neurological disorders among 177 men within a single year. These figures are likely conservative, as prisoners were disincentivized from reporting illnesses to avoid further punishment and reduced rations. With all of these, the mortality rate of these camps was around 30%, which means out of 100, only 70 would survive. Now, you will wonder how they survived such brutal conditions first. They were trained, but it was the resilience and actions of these prisoners that helped them. Some secretly sabotaged the work they were forced to do, especially those working on the death railway. They would intentionally weaken structures or create makeshift traps to slow down Japanese progress. This form of defiance, although risky, gave the prisoners a sense of control over their fate, even if only for a short while. Other forms of resistance were more subtle. In camps like Wusong, Major James P.S. Devereaux encouraged his men not to salute their Japanese captors, an act that risked severe punishment but preserved their dignity. Sometimes, humor became a tool for survival. American soldiers, for instance, would give their Japanese guards demeaning nicknames, mocking them in secret as a way to reclaim some sense of normalcy in an otherwise oppressive environment. In some camps, prisoners organized secret educational programs, such as the University on the River Kwai, where they taught each other languages, mathematics, and engineering. This not only provided a distraction from the horrors of camp life, but also helped maintain a sense of dignity and hope among the prisoners. They also engaged in acts of covert resistance, such as sabotaging Japanese equipment and smuggling food to those who were too weak to fend for themselves. All of these alliances and tactics helped many to survive that harsh conditions. Thankfully, the war ended in 1945. Many POWs were too weak to even stand. For those who survived, liberation did not mark the end of their suffering. Many spent months in hospitals recovering from the effects of starvation, disease, and injury. The psychological scars were deep, with many POWs suffering from PTSD for the rest of their lives. A study conducted after the war found that over 70% of former POWs exhibited symptoms of PTSD. This was one of the few dark chapters for history. To check more, click the left video, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other videos.